the good, the bad, and the uh-oh. Every car on the road has control arms, and some might have a lot of them, some might have just a few. The common factor here is they all have rubber bushings, at least on one end of that control arm, and rubber does not last forever. So eventually they're going to have to be replaced, whether you do just the bushing or the control arm as an assembly. But how do you know it's the right time to replace them? If you have a new vehicle that's only a few years old and doesn't have many miles on it, you really don't have that much to worry about in regards to the control arms and their bushings. However, time and mileage does put a toll on these bushings. So let's say you have a vehicle that's about 10 years old, maybe it has a little bit over 100,000 miles on it. That's when you want to start thinking about these. Right here is a control arm with a somewhat worn bushing. That came out of a vehicle that has about 100,000 miles and it's about 7 years old, and you can see the cracks that are developing in this rubber bushing. So remember what I said earlier, 100,000 miles, about 10 years old is when you start seeing this kind of wear, and it's totally normal. Now, what you'll notice when this starts happening is actually while you're driving, you might not even feel anything. You might not even hear anything. But maybe you're doing a different repair and you see the control arm hanging low as the car is jacked up and you see the bushing stretched and a bunch of cracks in it. Should you be concerned? Well, no, don't be worried yet, but this is the time that you want to think about maybe heading over to oneauto.com and keeping in mind the fact that you need new control arms and at least the bushings soon. The cracks that you see here might not seem like a whole lot right now, and like I said, you don't really have to be worried about them at the moment. However, the progression of this bushing breaking down, the next step would be it starting to squeak and maybe creak over bumps or even really small unevenness in the road. That is the bushing splitting, and now the two pieces of rubber are rubbing against each other, causing that noise that you're hearing. So you don't want to leave this as is for a long time, because it will keep progressing. Now, keep in mind the other side is also on the same vehicle, traveling on the same terrain, so the other side is probably in the same condition as this. But let's see what happens if it gets worse. I have a control arm here that has a bushing that is completely shot. And I can demonstrate exactly why, because if I try to move this bushing around with my pry bar, it moves all right, it pops right out. And the inner sleeve being completely separated, if I ever see this in a vehicle where the control arm is still mounted but it's completely split, I would personally not drive that vehicle. I would consider this unsafe, and I'll explain in a little bit why. But along with this symptom of the bushing being completely split, when you drive like this, if you happen to, which again, I don't recommend, you'll almost hear the bushing thumping underneath the car every time you hit a bump, almost like someone smacking the underside of the car with a rubber mallet. And that is because all this rubber here, as your wheel hits a bump, when it's mounted inside, still mounted, it's actually going to hit the inner sleeve up against the outer sleeve of the bushing, whatever's left of it, and it's going to move around like that, causing that thumping noise that you're hearing. A little bit kind of like a clunk, but it's deeper, more soft, actually. That's why I said a rubber mallet, because it's not a metal noise that you're hearing. We have this car over here that had bad control arm bushings, and, well, I followed my own recommendations, and I put 2 brand new control arm assemblies in this vehicle, and as a bonus, these come with the ball joints, so I got to refresh those at the same time. Everything's back together, so let's use the same pry bar, pry in the same spot on the control arm bushing to see how much less movement we have. Looking at it, you can see it moves a little bit, which is normal, and we have no noise, so that's a huge improvement. Let's compare this to the old control arm, and wow, that is a lot of movement and a whole lot of noise, which, by the way, was happening on both front control arms. That is why I replaced both. As always, remember that if you do any steering or suspension work, you always need to get an alignment afterwards so you can make sure your tires are worn evenly.